This poem is called Marcus Aurelius in Freshman English. Asinine Marcus, minister of spit takes, slow crawl of sentences forming somewhere in the tonsils, tries my patience. Everyone does. A thick disbelief of our lives coats us into the afternoon. How did we get here? Marcus, he of mouthful, he of ham fist, copies another kid's paper. He of the cock crow of the third string defense, he the destroyer of grace. He uses a sci-fi cartoon for the metaphor of your heart being a crystal or a wave of light. Marcus, he of no green vegetable, bullfrog of no neighborhood pond. Marcus, the antidote to optimism. Well-meaning oleo, rending the innards of whoever eats it. Marcus loves me. He of the saggy handwriting, he of the doe eye, he of helpless lapse at the icicle of truth, he of just tasted snow. Marcus of forsaken fireplace, Marcus the newly baptized infant dumb, mistaking the fur-headed dandelions for sons.
Welcome to Mighty Banyans on the Bay, the New College Faculty Podcast. My name is Alicia Mercado-Harvey. I'm Assistant Professor for Spanish and History.
And I'm Douglas Estes, Associate Professor of Religion here at New College. We are excited today to have Professor Avni Vyas here with us. She's Assistant Professor of Creative Writing here at New College. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Great. So the first thing that we want to ask is, you're a poet.
Yeah.
Tell us what it's like to be a poet.
The way I describe it is, and you'll relate because we live in Florida, right? So when we spend a lot of time in the sun, we get a sunburn, don't we? So we need like SPF when we go out into the world. Being a poet and being sensitive to language means that language comes from all angles. I need SPF 1,000,000 when I go out into the world. That's what it feels like, which is hyperbole. So
Yes.
I think that, I think you're sensitive to language, but it's also, I can't imagine being anything else. It's just, it's a tremendous privilege to get to be a poet in the world, and I think more of us are poets than we care to admit, and I think we are probably somewhere in our heart of hearts always kind of composing poems to the things we love anyway. So if we do it right, maybe we're all poets.
Right. Very few have the courage, though. That is the thing with being a poet. You have to have the courage to put yourself out there. So tell us a little bit about that process of the courage to come out and say, I'm a poet.
Oh, that's a great question. So I was born overseas. My family is from India, and I was originally born there. And when we emigrated to the United States, learning, like, language was a huge component of everything in my life, right? So I have a very multicultural family. We have people who speak multiple languages, polyglots all over. So I was surrounded by Gujarati, Hindi, English, Spanish, and all of those really informed a big part of my childhood. And, you know, it's funny because I wouldn't call it courageous necessarily, but when people ask, why do you write? My answer is always, paper never interrupts. So that's usually a good place to begin. But eventually, having the courage to call yourself a poet, part of me always thinks, you know, life is short. And the world is always in a moment of chaos. And we are always playing with it and trying to find solace against it. And if there is so much chaos in the world, and if our time here is so short, then why wait? You know, we are all a lot braver than we realize when we feel that full level of pressure. So at a certain point, I don't know if it's courage as much as I don't have the energy to be shy about it anymore. I'm a poet. Now you know.
Great. That's a great answer.
So tell us a little bit about the classes that you teach here.
I came to creative writing by way of the writing program where I was for 7 years. I was hired in 2017 as an instructor of writing, and in those classes I taught mostly intro to rhetoric, but because of New College's unique program, I was also able to sponsor creative writing tutorials and collaborate with other faculty members who wanted writing support. And so not the possibility, but the activity and the interest and the student momentum was already here. So when I got to creative writing proper, now I'm teaching Introduction to Poetry. I'm currently teaching an intermediate and advanced poetry workshop. All of those build off of previous tutorials that I have taught. I also got to teach creative nonfiction previously, so I'm able to integrate some of that. And those are primarily what I teach here, poetry and nonfiction. And they seem like genres, but really they are wonderful ways of seeing the world.
Right. And we have a brand new major.
Yes.
As of what, last year or this year? This year, right? In creative writing for all the students out there who are interested in that. Very good. Yeah. So one thing I'm really interested in is your teaching of rhetoric, because you have, ancient rhetoric, and then you have the so-called new rhetoric that they talk about and that sort of thing. And why is rhetoric so important for students to learn, in your opinion?
So I can give this answer from a few points of view. One, I think it's really when we think about where our students are right now in terms of their both their education and the world that they're going into upon graduation, rhetoric turns into a kind of literacy. And really where I think a lot of higher ed is right now is we are contending with what literacy truly is and how our students are engaging it. So having a foundational background in how writing communicates, I think is so important, not just to understand historical foundational context, but also that students are practicing rhetoricians, whether or not they recognize it. So one of the best descriptions I've heard of it is rhetoric is kind of a force like gravity. And so we're always impacted by it, whether or not we recognize it. But then there are people like skydivers or, gymnasts and other kinds, I'm thinking of BMX bike riders who recognize that gravity is a part of their, part of what they do. And so they're working with and against it. And that kind of knowledge base, I think, positions our students to understand their role as a communicator and to recognize that the way that they engage with a text and the way they engage with an audience, they have way more power than they realize. And so to contextualize that, I think is important for students to understand who they are as thinkers, but also as writers. And then, when we think of rhetoric as a field of study, we don't often think about it in terms of poetry. But poems are just as much, we have rhetorical affect, we can have poetic artifice, but we also have argumentation. We have imagery that kind of works with both a logos and a pathos. And so, when we think of, say, ethos, pathos, and logos, those aren't necessarily clean divisions. They're almost like primary colors. And then we learn how to engage them, and we discover what kind of palette we have, and then we decide what it is we want to paint with that. So I think poetry can arrive as a kind of canvas for students to practice all of those things. But if we do it right, then poetry becomes a lifelong conversation that our students get to have with themselves when they leave us, and that's a pretty powerful body of knowledge to carry with you as well.
Now, I have a question. Douglas mentioned, this new AOC in creative writing, which has been a long-standing request, right, at New College, something that the faculty wanted for a long time. Finally, it's happening, very exciting. So how do you envision, because you, painting on a canvas, you have the opportunity of creating something new, which is really, really exciting.
Well, yeah, so that's a great question. And it's interesting because it's, in many ways, creative writing has always been on New College's campus, right? So even before we had this program or these positions, we had visiting positions, we had writers in residence. So for a long time, the college really did want to have some kind of artistic element and some kind of conversation with students. And the way that they had it before was really to allow an organic discovery of what that could be. But within AOC, we also now see so many opportunities for interdisciplinarity. We see how, poets don't write simply about poetry, and they don't simply write just for other poets. Poetry engages the world at large, and, I would argue that one thing that surprises a lot of students when they take creative writing classes is when they're reading, fiction or they're reading poetry and they're learning new information. They're thinking like, I didn't know those facts about the octopus, right? I didn't realize that, so-and-so had to research how a bakery works in order to write this piece of fiction. So in many ways, the art of creating relies heavily on how we inform our own relationships with other disciplines. And so I think what I'm looking forward to most is seeing how those relationships continue to grow on this campus.
Sounds great.
Yeah. So when we think about students becoming poets, how does that work? I mean, it seems like being creative writing, it's like a great idea, but how do they come study and then find jobs and do life this way?
Another way to maybe think about that question is, how does poetry set you up for what comes next?
Yeah, thank you. That's a much better way of saying it.
No, I just want to make sure I understand the answer. So one way to think about it is poetry and create any kind of creative, imaginative writing, as we call it, requires a great deal. I mean, when we talk about literacy, we're not just talking about the ability to read and comprehend, but we're thinking about how we spend time with language. So poetry, students often encounter it or having come out of classrooms where it's been taught or framed as a kind of puzzle that they have to figure out, or it's an algorithm, and if they get it just right, then they unlock the poem's meaning. So that really presents a challenge because it creates kind of a block for a lot of students where they're like, well, I like to write poetry, and I have feelings and I have things to say, but I haven't really ever seen poems that look like mine in the world, or I don't know if my voice gets to, exist as I want it to in the world based on what I've read before. So one thing that we get to do in these workshops is sort of disabuse this idea that poetry has one way of being read or being experienced. And so what we're also talking about is sensitivity, receptivity, and attunement. You can see all of the ways that those kind of soft skills arrive in the marketplace. So not only are you a skilled communicator because you spend time with language, you are also a flexible thinker. You're able to demonstrate contrasts and comparisons by virtue of your time with metaphor. I know poets who go on to be lawyers who have fantastic careers in advertising and public relations. So that literacy, again, links back to rhetoric when we're thinking about larger communications, purpose-driven communications, but also poetry allows us to experience the world through language and pleasure. And I think that's one of the scary parts of it, honestly, for students, where they're like, I didn't know I'm supposed to be having an experience, an actual embodied experience with language. And I mean, think about the ways that attunes you to your career, where you can find an alignment or a disalignment. Many poets go on to be fantastic educators. They support the arts and literacies in their communities. So there's no, just in the way that when we sit down to write a poem, there are infinite possibilities as to what arrives on the page. You can kind of extend that thinking into how it arrives in the rest of the world. The question is really, is the world ready for a generation of poets to show up and witness and see and feel everything?
Yeah, and adding to what you're saying, I mean, there's so many different paths as students even imagine possibilities of what they can do. I mean, I'm thinking about my close example. My brother-in-law went to NIU, studied to be a screenplayer, to write. And then in the end, obviously so competitive, the market to do that he decided to go into writing content for platforms, for networks, so HBO, Paramount, and he's had a very successful career for years doing that, and he's working with the language, as you're exactly saying.
Those skills are so transferable as well.
They really are.
So whether it's creative writing or even academic writing, you see that literacy, and we see this also in students, and I imagine that you've seen this in your own classrooms, but when students connect to an idea or a subject, you see their language generate and shift and grow and expand. And so when we're seeing those thinking patterns kind of start to develop, drawing our attention to them can really set students up to know, like, this is the thing that I'm doing right now, and I can do whatever I want with this on the
Right,
other
and the
side.
discovering on the part of
Yeah.
the student. You know, I had a little bit of experience with this, having an ISP and creative writing in
Yeah,
Spanish,
that's right.
and I had students, you know, from obviously native speakers of Spanish, but they never had the intention to be writers. And some of the had one student in computer science who wrote
Yes.
like fantastic
Yeah.
stuff, and he was wanting to take the ISP
Yeah.
to improve his writing skills, not to write fiction, but his fiction was fantastic.
Yeah.
And so they discovered an ability that they didn't know they had.
Yeah, and I think too, when students get to be in a position of power, you know, you are the expert of your own thoughts. You're the one in charge. You know, I'm your reader. You get to tell me how I navigate this text. There is also a lot of power there that maybe hasn't been before, and so that process can be a lot of fun to play with and challenge, and you know, there's a lot to grow from there.
You know, actually, I can see your generation of poets. Science fiction teaches us that what's going to happen is that AI is going to be able to do all kinds of really cold and hard text, and there won't be a need for it anymore. There'll be a need for poetry and beauty and aesthetics.
That's so interesting you say that, because there's currently a huge conversation about the ways AI is being trained on published authors' works. So there's an
Yes.
entire repository where authors are discovering that their creative work is basically being used against, you know, without their consent to train AI models. And part of that is so that AI can generate voice. And so while there are, yes, you know, hard and fast results that AI can generate, I think what we're coming up against is, what does the human, like, where do we center the human in this process? And there was a study that came out, I want to say a few months ago, I mean, it's pretty recent, where a range of readers were given human-generated poetry and AI-generated poetry, and then they were asked to rank their preferences. And these were, I think the audience, or the readers themselves, did not identify as poetry readers. So what the study ended up showing is that people preferred AI verse over human verse.
Really? Interesting.
So it was, you know, what we're also discovering is that the audience has a different kind of expectation. And then we're also seeing that engagement with AI is maybe illustrating a kind of immediacy that, I don't know, in my experience, feels kind of counterintuitive to the poetic process. Poems take time. Creative writing takes time. So it's not just about writing something that fits a shape or has a particular rhyme scheme or sounds nice, but when we compare poems that work to poems that last, there's quite a range.
Right.
So one of the questions I've really been sitting with is, what does my human nature have to do with what comes next in the future? And I think that's going to be a really direct question for all of us to have to contend with.
So, just curiosity, do you think that the reason why the study showed that the audience preferred the AI generated was because the AI generated was sort of standardized and blocky and, you know, traditional, maybe not lacking the delicate brushstrokes of an actual person?
Perhaps, but just as there are all sorts of poets and writers, there's all sorts of AI as well.
Well, that's true. Right.
So ChatGPT, I mean, and we've played with this.
Okay.
So ChatGPT would generate something that we might point to the page and say, who wrote this? Who's it for? That's clearly AI. It sounds like whatever.
Yeah.
And, you know, we even tried this in my intro to poetry class. And so I printed out an AI poem. One of the prompts that I gave them, I fed to ChatGPT, and then we discussed the results. And so we were really thinking about, you know, how does the fact that this was AI generated inform our response to the poems? What is it telling us about audience expectations? So if we see something, you know, in AB rhyme scheme, is that because that's the marking of a good poem, or is that because it's what we expect as standard poetry? And, you know, these are fruitful questions for us to think about as readers and audience members, but I think that also connects to the other part of my question. Who is reading poetry right now?
Right.
So rather than, you know, what traditional forms look like or experimental, I mean, happy to report that poets are doing everything. You know, we have incredible formal poets who are living and giving readings tomorrow, which is fantastic. It's amazing to see. We also have highly experimental avant-garde poets who are really shattering what poetry could have been or can be. And so I'm working with computer science students who are building poems in Python. You know, they're playing with these technologies in really profound ways, and it's because it's a human doing it, right? So it's the play that is really revealing something, but it's also revealing that we don't think about poetry as a kind of play, and we don't necessarily connect that. So maybe an AI-generated poem looks a little safer on the page, and perhaps that's more inviting for readers. But if you truly derive pleasure from what language can do and stretching your experience with language, then perhaps you have a more of a receptivity to human-generated verse, for better or worse, you know?
Yeah. I was going to ask you, how are you navigating assignments? Because I had this issue during my SB that I had people try to write stuff, and I could immediately tell the first sentence. How are you navigating that?
Let me throw the question back at you. How did you know?
Oh, it's yeah, as a writer, I could tell right away.
Were there features that the text contained that you could like point to and say,
Yes, because you know.
And I agree. Yes,
when you talk to the student, you know their capacity of the language. You know what their capacity is in the language, in the speech, and then you see something perfectly written, no mistake. You immediately know. I mean, this is not.
And there's a few schools of thought, right? So on one hand, it's do I tell ChatGPT the kind of story that I want to produce, and then it produces something, and then I get a pass? Often what I look for is where is the speaker in the poem? Who are they addressing? What's at stake? What is the tension? And so, you know, if a student does submit something that looks pretty, ultimately it's just not as effective of a poem as it could be if, you know, there was a thoughtful human in the works. And so often if I read a draft like that, it's usually something that we talk about in workshop, and then students have more questions to chew over, and perhaps a bigger one that the student is leaving with is, why did I use ChatGPT in the first place? Because one thing I want my students to understand is the end result is not producing a beautiful poem. The end result is how you are changing, shifting, and growing because you've engaged in this process. So if you're submitting a perfectly polished draft that has no mistakes in it, what we're also seeing is that perhaps there's an assumption on the side of the student that this is the kind of writing they anticipate their professors wanting. So I've had to go as far as say to my writing about writing students, when you have typos and misspelled words, and I can see your thinking on the page, I need you to know how much that means to me, which is such a, you know, backwards approach. I would say normally proofread for clarity and make sure there are no mistakes. But in a draft, when I can see a student working through an idea, there's something really exciting about getting to be a part of their process. So what I'm really trying to show students, I can't control what they do in their private lives or the role that AI might occupy in the future. But what I can do is center the importance of thinking, and that's why we're here together, and that's what we're doing together. And so even when we get together in a poetry classroom, I mean, it's sort of magical. Here's a group of people who elected to be in a room and share poems together. It's an incredible gift. So, you know, if there is a shortcut that you want to take, boy, you're missing out. And so I don't know, I really do try to affirm how poetry humanizes us, but also connects us to each other. And so the more we can build our skills and take emotional risks that way, I think we benefit both as thinkers and writers overall.
And when you talked about feelings, I think that this is something very important, that in art generally, you know, the emotions are an important thing. So one thing that I cannot see AI doing in the future is generating, as much as they can copy things, that human feeling that when you read something that really moves you, there's a human behind, because the human had felt that emotion. I don't know AI, I don't know how you feel about this, that could generate that.
Yeah, well, I think too, what you're also saying is that you're sensitive to that because you're well read, you read. And again, this comes back to literacy, right? So because we're reading, because we're allowing ourselves to be impacted, and because we're receiving, our own experiences with language, we're attuning to the text that's generated. And, when I read a Chipotle menu, I'm not supposed to experience enlightenment, right? But if I go to a fine dining establishment and they've got a beautiful description of something that I wouldn't ordinarily order, that might actually, shift me in that direction.
Right.
So again, I think it comes back to wearing SPF 1,000,000, and I've got plenty, and I'm happy to share with both of you should you need it in the future.
Okay. Sounds good.
But that's what happens when we become poets in the world, right?
I think Chipotle would hope that you were moved by reading their menu, like the.
I mean,
like the,
there
yeah.
have been days when I have gone to a Chipotle and wept tears of joy.
Oh, okay.
So
right.
I'm not saying that text can't maneuver in that
Yeah.
way.
Yeah.
Let's not sell Chipotle short here.
Right. Right.
But
I just mean the potential is there.
Yeah, right.
There's so much potential. It's fascinating hearing you talk, because it would be easy for someone who is not that familiar with creative writing programs to think, it's kind of not with the times, maybe traditional, or, not dealing with AI. I mean, but you're at the forefront of dealing with an aspect of AI, even here in creative writing, right?
Yeah.
And so, I mean, it just is a wonderful opportunity for students to come and experience that humanity, that humanness of creating poetry. What is the type of poetry? Like, is there names for the type of poetry that you create, like your genre or style, or?
yes, but they're secret. So
They're
can't
secret.
tell you.
Okay, all right.
No, just kidding.
Okay.
I love formal traditions, but I also just really enjoy how poets play and expand those traditions. I'm really into what I've been working with recently, and I kind of shift between modes, but I've been really interested in erasure, and thinking about how digital composition opens up the field of erasure poetry in a whole new exciting way for me. But I'm also thinking about how free verse affords a kind of liberty, and I think it was Robert Frost. It's like no tennis without a net. There's an expectation and an understanding of both prosody. So if prosody and argumentation, if you're working in free verse, it's really tempting to say I can do whatever I want, and often that's a little scarier to do whatever you want in some ways if you're not quite sure what the poem is doing or what your relationship with the text is. But I think we have so many forms to kind of explore and experience. And what's also very exciting is how formal poets now are also incorporating elements of prosody to create forms that don't have names but have clear shapes and clear patterns. So yeah, there are all kinds of poems. Generally, we talk about, you can kind of divide two schools, and sometimes they share work in between, but we often talk about a lyric mode and a more narrative mode, and they serve slightly different purposes. A lyric mode might draw some associative leaps and images. A narrative mode is going to incorporate a few more structural elements to cue the reader along a chronology, but they're both going to rely heavily on the same poetic toolbox.
Okay, so I have a real question for you here.
All right.
Okay, so I'm a hack poet.
Let's hear it, yes.
I've actually, I have published one poem. Yeah. And but I like ABAB, and I do a lot of limericks and other things like that, very traditional. Can I be in your program?
Yeah, come on in.
Even with limericks?
I mean, listen, we're gonna push back.
Okay.
And I'm gonna say, why did you just write one limerick when you could have written 25?
Okay.
Dr. Estes,
Right,
why are you
right.
holding out? And then I'm gonna say, I think you've really figured out this form and how it works and the rhythms.
I see.
And I'm interested in the ideas, and I would love to see how you would explore them in a different shape. So how would you put a revision in conversation with your original draft? And if my students hear me, they are rolling their eyes because they've heard me say that several times.
Okay.
But you would be very welcome.
Okay, good. And Alicia too, because she's quite the creative writer herself.
Yeah, and I'm just realizing that I don't write poetry, but I come from a line of poetry like my genes back. But I wrote one for my latest novel that I just had to create it. I had to write something that another author wrote. So I basically had to mimic a style, within the story. So I'd realized, oh yeah, I've written a poem too. It's published actually, and I hadn't even thought about it. But I would love to take your classes too.
Come on down.
Yes.
Right. So.
Yeah.
I was just gonna, say that we're coming to a close, right?
Yes, that's right.
A fantastic podcast, and I wanted to ask you as a last thing about your education. We didn't talk anything about this, because people wonder, well, what is the path of creative writing, right? Because MFA usually is. But you have a PhD, right? So that's what I wanted to ask you, because you went to, you're a Florida girl, right? When it comes to education, like you did, like me, University of Florida for your undergraduate and your MFA, and then you went for your PhD to FSU. So tell us a little bit about that.
Well, so I did my bachelor's and my first master's at the University of Florida. My first master's was in English education. My poetry professor cautioned me against that path, and he said, you want to be a poet. Why are you going into education? And I, in my mind, I was thinking because this path makes a lot of sense for me. So I had some experience teaching in the secondary field, and then I really felt like now is the time. Let's see what happens with an MFA, and that was just such a rewarding experience. And these days graduate school is so up in the air. So even if you have a terminal degree, a MFA or a PhD, there's no guarantee on the other side that there's a job waiting for you. So really, what I found very valuable about that process was deepening my own relationship with this relationship that I'm going to have for the rest of my life. So I've gotten this incredible gift of graduate school, and that's staying with me no matter where I go, no matter where my career takes me. And so that's one path to becoming a poet in the world, but there are so many. And for so many writers, they're thinking, okay, I don't have the capacity to go to graduate school right now. How do I continue building my language skills? And there are we live in such a rich community of artists and writers, and there's so many community resources as well. And I look forward to linking our students with them, because I would love for our students to also see there's no one way to be a poet in the world.
That's great.
Well, it's been great to have Professor Avni Vyas here with us today. Great conversation about creative writing. We invite you to come and be a part of the creative writing program here at New College.
And if you have any questions, comments, anything, her email, right? It's on our website, so you can just look it up and send her questions if you have any. And we're encouraging you also to post any of your questions on our YouTube channel, anything you have, feedback for us. So as we always finish every episode, we go, Go Mighty Banyans!